All right, so we'll be talking about, I have a few loose ends from the previous meeting that I think will be helpful. And then we'll just swing into talking about Out of the Silent Planet, which is the first of the trilogy books. So the the loose ends from last week really trigger off what Professor Wayland said about this book. And he mentioned the temptation scene of Tinadril, that's the Eve of Venus, and he mentioned that Weston, the bad guy in the story, used logic for a time to try to tempt her to disobey God, and it was working. He certainly was overpowering Ransom's ability to resist that, but it wasn't quite enough. And then he switched to using narratives, and he ended up creating a kind of a self-regarding attitude in Eve, which almost sealed the deal. And I wanted to point out that description has apologetic and evangelism lessons in it. All right, by switching to stories, Weston was really appealing to her unconscious mind. And I wanted to refresh you on the folks that listen to the fake news description. The mental model I used for that talk, and I use for most everything, is this three-part. Consciousness is above the horizontal line, and then the very powerful unconscious mind is below it. And the rational part, you take in information from the real world, and you wrestle with it using a holistic big picture view of the right brain way of viewing reality, and also the left brain looks at things granularly, and you back and forth between those two thinking modes when you're wrestling with something consciously. And that's what the logic part when Weston was tempting her. But he decided to switch to narratives, which if you remember, the unconscious mind is a powerful pattern recognition unit. It remembers patterns, and it sees patterns where your conscious mind might not observe them. The unconscious does see them. And I think that's one of the reasons the Bible is filled with stories in it, and that really appeals to the inner us, where your character is. C.S. Lewis and others would call that the heart. All right. So that's what Weston was doing, and that has apologetic possibilities. In fact, a very well-respected Oxford scholar, Alistair McGrath, he's an expert in C.S. Lewis too, by the way, published a book recently, last year, 2019, called Narrative Apologetics. And he works up the idea that using narratives in your evangelism, and you're dealing with trying to save somebody, is a very powerful thing. And he even points out that you can look at that model not only in terms of an individual, but that's what civilization, that's what cultures do. If you talk about Western civilization, what do they talk about the beginning of it? Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, the heroic descriptions, and that helped form the Greek character. So those stories that were described and thought about consciously, unconsciously get into the DNA of the society and affect the way people behave. So this idea of using stories is powerful, and that's how cultures remember and hold on to their values. So that's one of the very sad things about current days. Seldom do people read great books anymore, and there's a cultural, or there's a time snobbery. Anything that's old is worthless. We want new things and all that sort of stuff. So the point is that idea of using stories has evangelistic potential. I wanted to mention that. Okay, so there's a couple other comments that I have issues, not issues, but like the comment from Professor Whalen. He said the science fiction, this was, I believe, in the interview. He said the science fiction is there, but it's pretty thin science. That's what he said. And I think it's partly because he didn't notice some of it, and I'll point out one I think he might not have noticed. I think actually C.S. Lewis's point of one of the points of the trilogy is science itself is pretty thin. One of the things that Whalen said at the very, very beginning, before he started his lecture, there was a little cameo shot of him, and he said that part of the theme of the trilogy is not only should men not, I think he said, men are fools if they think they can then make nature subject to their wills. It's not only a bad idea, it's totally foolish or something to that extent. And basically that's what you have in the trilogy is one man, and then in the last book it's an organization trying to make, he used his quote that make nature sit up and beg. Science tries to make nature sit up and beg. So that's one of the themes. But I'll point out something I think that you might find kind of interesting. Here's the definition of science that I think helps point out that it is thin. And this is a definition that comes from the National Science Teachers Association. It says science by definition is limited to naturalistic methods and explanations, and as such is precluded from using supernatural elements in the production of, quote, scientific knowledge. This is part of it is that's why science is empirically based. So but later in that same document, they said, however, the scientific questions asked, the observations made, and the conclusions in science are to some extent influenced by the existing state of knowledge, but also the social and cultural context of the researcher and the observer's experience expectations. So lurking in there, they're kind of admitting that scientific knowledge is partially subjective and socially and culturally embedded. And so I believe the Space Trilogy is pushing hard on the idea there's a lot of that in a sense, subjectivity and all that going on in science, and people just have been grudgingly accepting it. So one of the video that came around, I believe it came around to all you folks by Michael Egnor on materialism. Jeff, did you send that out? You know, the one where he's interviewed and talks about neuroscience?
I don't think I sent that out. I can try. Let me do it after this class.
Yeah. Okay. There's a wonderful video. It's not terribly long. It's by a neuroscientist. His name is Michael Egnor, and he gives the various, in a sense, consciousness arguments against materialism, and is very convincing. And everybody involved in apologetics, science-based apologetics, really should see those videos. But at the very end, he points out that the materialist assumption has actually retarded the whole progress in neuroscience, because they keep rejecting the idea that consciousness can have immaterial aspect to it. they keep thinking, I mean, keep pushing the idea that it's really just a bunch of neurons firing and so on. And there's nothing immaterial. But Egnor shows various experiments that pretty convincingly show that there's something immaterial, not matter, energy, space, or time, involved in consciousness. So, all right. Now, here's an example of the science sometimes hard to spot in Out of the Silent Planet. This is page 41 in the edition I have. And he says, he wondered how, and I took words out, so that's the dots or places I took the words out, but it still forms a sentence. He wondered how the Earths formed not by addition to, but by subtraction from the surrounding brightness. That's the big part of it. So here's the picture. Matter is really energy trapped and immobile. Light is energy on the move. In fact, it goes the speed of light. So it's kind of self-propelled energy on the move. And what he's saying, the material, the Earth, is energy trapped. It doesn't have the motion that it used to have. It's trapped and somewhat immobile. And it's like a condensation of energy. So that the E equals mc squared says, in effect, to me, materialism is a trap. It's trapping energy. And it prevents you from seeing the light. So I like that analogy that he uses, and it's hard to spot. It took me about the third reading till I finally noticed that. Wow, he's really, in a sense, taking advantage of relativity theory, E equals mc squared. So I thought that was, to me, a very powerful literary type to suggest that the physical science reality relates to a philosophical or spiritual reality. Here's another one of the literary types that are in this book and worth tracking down if you're reading it, and that's from page 33. He was in the capsule heading towards Mars, and stretched naked on the bed because it was so incredibly hot there. A second Danae, holy he imagined, sweet influence pouring or even stabbing into his surrendered body. So I looked up, who is this? And it turns out there's a Greek mythology story, and the king, there was a prophecy that the king, Acrisius, was going to be replaced by his daughter's child, but she was childless. And so to keep the prophecy from coming true, he locked her in a tower. However, Zeus had seen her, and she was quite lovely, I guess. And so during the night, Zeus appeared to her in the form of golden rain and impregnated her. And sure enough, she had a child. And sure enough, the child took over the kingdom. But this is one of the, remember that Professor Whalen mentioned that the idea of masculine and feminine is throughout the trilogy, and the differences and the important differences. And to deny those differences is a mistake, he believes. This is one of them. That picture of first off, the mythology is definitely a masculine feminine thing, and Ransom sitting, lying there and having the influences from the cosmos going into his surrendered body. That's a feminine in a sense situation. So there's a lot of that kind of imagery if you read slowly enough and think about it. And it's I think quite beautiful and thought-provoking. All right. So here's my second issue with Professor Whalen, and it's how do you pronounce HNAU? He says NAU, and but in the introduction to the Hideous Strength, C.S. Lewis says the theme of this book is the same as I had in Abolition of Man, and in Abolition of Man, he has a concept called the Tao. And the Tao is a universal moral ethical code that occurs. Most cultures throughout human history have had a fairly similar moral and ethical code. And so I think the poet in C.S. Lewis would say it's now to rhyme with Tao, because Tao is something universal and human, and now is the word used to describe human-like creatures. that's my poetic contribution for this. But anyhow, the Abolition of Man is a quite good book. Very difficult. Some people think it's the most difficult of his apologetic works, but it's a very useful book. And I think I mentioned it. C.S. Lewis started out wanting to be a poet, and he found out he was an okay poet, but he had no real talent. But his talent, his prose is remarkable. All right. So now we'll get into talking about the storyline and a little more. So here's a very famous quote from C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, the sun, but because by it I see everything else. And I really think C.S. Lewis, with his imagination, tried to see everything else. Another quote from Owen Barfield, who was an Inkling and a very close friend of Lewis, somehow what he, that's Lewis, thought about everything was secretly present in what he said or wrote about anything. And I really think that C.S. Lewis embedded in the Space Trilogy some speculations that are interesting and will spark your imagination, that span from before the start to after the end of the present universe. That is, from before Book of Genesis to beyond the Book of Revelation. Very, very interesting stuff, I think. All right, so here's some scripture references that might have triggered some of his ideas. So this is Revelation chapter 21, and it's describing the city, the New Jerusalem. And part of it, verse 24, it says, first off, it's spilling out light, and the nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. All right, that means the kings of the earth will spend at least a little time outside of the city. All right. And it says, and it had 12 gates, as we know from Jeff's class. All right, and then 26 says, the glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. That means there's glory and honor outside of the city. All right. I think, and by the way, the word nations is from a Greek word ethnos, which can mean species, I suppose. It can mean tribe. It can mean a lot of ethnic differences. And you'll see there are different species on this planet we're about to talk about. But I think, and so I think the kings which are, saved Christians and the ones that I think finish their training, go out and rule somewhere. And C.S. Lewis has an idea where that is, or has a speculation about it. Here's another one, Revelation 22. It said, all right, there's a tree of life is in the city, and it bears fruit, and it says, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations, the ethnos, the ones outside the city, maybe outside the planet. all right? And they're healing. That means they're growing. They're still being nurtured. So I think C.S. Lewis has a picture. God is a gardener, and the earth is a greenhouse to raise the future kings of the bigger garden he has in mind. And the new heavens and earth, 100 billion galaxies. Everybody says, oh, it's a completely new heaven and a completely new earth and all that. But I think C.S. Lewis is saying, well, it might not be all that different. And basically his story, this story, gives something for the angels to do. They were, many, many angels. What did they do? He gives them something to do. All right. And he gives something for us to do after we complete our training. Planets to nurture and grow love in various things. I think the whole thing, God is a gardener. He intends to grow nurturing love, and he intends to grow a lot of it all over the universe. I think that's C.S. Lewis's picture. It makes sense in a sense to me. All right, so here's the first book. Here's the individual one if you bought it. And there's a picture of Ransom is in one of their canoes. The one of the species is does fishing and has canoes and does some things. And there's a picture of that there. And there's water, there's rivers in Mars. All right, and here's the storyline. Okay, so there's this philologist. He's a person that studies language. So he's very good at language. And he's abducted by this crazy physicist and is greedy accomplice and taken via spaceship to Mars. And it's because the physicist and his accomplice think they want a human sacrifice. See, they had been to Mars one time before, couldn't couldn't communicate very well, and the somebody on you'll find out later who it is. I'll tell you. Said, "Go get us another person," and there's a reason for that, which we'll talk later. But they interpreted it as they wanted a human sacrifice. They viewed these people as very primitive, and so it turns out Ransom fits the bill. And I'll explain that in a few minutes. Okay. But once landed, Ransom gets away from them, and he starts exploring and trying to find things, and he gets caught up in this marvelous planet that's way different from Earth and so on. And what he does is he bumps into these three intelligent, rational, sentient beings, physical species that co-inhabit Mars. Yeah. And they're in utopic harmony and equality with each other. And being an Earthling, Ransom says, something's wrong. Who's the dictator? There must be a dictator to keep this place so orderly and everything. And he views it initially from his fallen picture of the way things are on Earth. But the three creatures were described by Professor Whalen. If you missed that, one is called Hross. That's large beaver-like warrior adventurers and poetic storytellers. They have adventures, and then they write poems about the adventures they have. And the Sorns, they're kind of thin, abstract thinkers, scientists and philosophers. And the Fiffletriggy, they're small, frog-like creatures, but they're craftsmen. They build clever things and very, very much different. And they get along beautifully. And they have no concept of evil. They have no word for lie. They end up calling these visitors from Earth bent. They have no way of saying evil because they don't have evil. They don't even think in terms of evil. So I have some quick questions that used in the previous class. I'll just use them to point out that this story. Remember, Professor Whalen said one of C.S. Lewis's desires is to spark your imagination and get your imagination going. And the scenes and the interactions get me to think, imagine, did I ever encounter anybody like this? Or have I ever encountered, I guess I encountered, oops, I misspelled that. I think it should be that, encountered. Primitive cultures. And what about cultures coexisting? What do I know about that? It just got my mind kind of soaring imaginatively about these things, and just got me thinking about it in many, many, many ways. And I'll show you some of the stuff I ended up thinking about. How it spawned me to think about things I wouldn't have thought about as well if I hadn't read this book. So Ransom starts out pretty much ordinary, a nice guy, ordinary, kind of modern, postmodern. He had prejudices. He had all those. By the way, the nice guy part was shown up right away. He was out, going for a sabbatical from his college. He taught at Cambridge or someplace, and he was going on a sabbatical. And as many people in England in those days did, they take walking tours. And he was on a walking tour, and he passed a house, and the woman came out, and she said, if you're going that way, look for my son. He's up there working on the neighboring farm, and he should be home by now. And he's a little slow. He might have gotten lost. Could you keep an eye out, look for my son? And Ransom says, sure, I will. And he goes up, and the farm, he ends up hearing some things. He ends up kind of trespassing into the farm, and he sees two people struggling with this young boy, like they're doing something to him or trying to push him somewhere and take him somewhere, and he interferes. And eventually it gets settled, and when Weston and Devine discover that he's on a sabbatical and he has no family, nobody's going to be checking on him for a month or more, whereas this kid has the mother checking. They decide they're not going to kidnap the kid, they're going to kidnap Ransom. And so because of that intervention, Ransom saves the boy, and the boy runs home. But they give Ransom a Mickey, and the next thing he wakes up on a spaceship. But the point is, he's a nice guy, but has all these prejudice, technological snobbery. He looks down on primitive cultures at first. Kind of sneering about the old-fashioned virtues, and he has a political cynicism. He is sure that the ruler of Mars is a dictator, and that oppression's all over the place, and he just hasn't found it yet, and he's looking for it. So in effect, he's a little bit like Lewis was before his conversion to Christianity. What happens is he has these encounters with morally superior creatures, and the encounters slowly elevate Ransom. And it's very interesting the way that happens. But here's some of the stuff I thought about. How would you describe a culture? How do they work, and so on? And you can think about it in terms of a culture is a group of people living in beneficial harmony with their environment, like First Nation people did in America. They had a beneficial, harmonious relationship with their environment. And that's basically what cultures do. That's what people do. If you want to have a good life, you try to be in harmony with the people and the culture you're embedded in. That's kind of a rule of life to strive to be in harmony with your culture. Okay, and at first, when a new culture comes along, like the Pilgrims came in, at first it worked out, and they did some things together and ate, and it was wonderful and things like that. But what happened? It turns out there was some irreconcilable difference with those cultures. And the one big thing was the First Nation people had a different concept of land ownership. the land belonged to everybody. And Europeans said, no, we draw boundaries and build fences, and that's how it is. And eventually it was pretty bad. And there was a lot of technological snobbery going on between these two cultures, and it didn't work out. Another primitive culture idea that came to me has reminded me, I was fortunate to go on a safari in Africa. And we visited places where people lived in huts made out of termite mounds and twigs and things and thatch roofs, and very, very, very primitive. One little village we went to had one electric bulb in the place, and very primitive. But this is a picture of one of the cloths that they make, and that whole area under the trees that you can't see, they were showing off their art. Here's one thing that we ended up getting. This is a whole fish. It's a beautiful thing, but it shows the big five animals. Basically, as far as I can tell, those people spend about half their time earning a living and subsistence farming or hunting and this and that, and the other half in production of art. That's what they do. And here's the decorations they put on the side of the hut of the chief of the tribe, of the village. And here's another one. They did art. So at first, and there's the thatch roofs they put on things. One of the things we did when we were driving in that vicinity, driving along the road, we saw piles of bundled thatch lying there. And I said, oh, what's that? And I said, oh, that's thatch for sale. These folks, one of the ways they earn money is they sell thatch. They take it to the edge of the road, they leave it there, and people come by and take the thatch and leave the money. And I said, well, doesn't anybody ever steal it? And he says, oh no, they don't steal it. It's the honor system is enforced, but they have an honor system. They have a way of dealing with each other which is harmonious and in many ways morally superior. They don't have locks on their doors. Things. It's in some ways very beautiful. So here's another culture, very much different and somewhat primitive. You might look down your nose at them, but the Amish people, this is in eastern Pennsylvania, they have chosen to reject technology, but yet they're in total harmony with the culture around them and with nature. Their farms are incredibly productive. There's a painting of harvest time, and this is a parking lot of a store, and everything's manicured. Their barns are manicured. Everything is craftsmanship and excellence wherever you look. And they get along with people driving cars and this and that, and everything is harmonious. In other words, harmony is possible if we can forget our prejudices about different things. And the reading of this book got me to think about lots and lots of things harmonious that I've seen and also non-harmonious in the city in which I lived and so on. So, all right, so what Ransom ends up learning courage and bravery from an exciting adventure with the cross. Now, one of the things about reading C.S. Lewis is the empathy that he draws you into the story. When they were in their canoes, by the way, their canoes, they surf with them kind of. There's ripples on these rivers, and they ride the ripples, and they go fast, and it's very interesting stuff. But the scene of hunting this creature, which was like Jaws, was exciting. I was fearful. It was really wonderful. The descriptions, he just draws you in. There's many benefits, I think, from reading this book. Okay, so he seeks the Oyarsa, keeps moving. He stays a while with the Haras, but he seeks Oyarsa partly because he wants to get away from Divine and Weston who are hunting for him, and partly he wants to find out how that society functions. He can't believe it's harmonious, and it's he still has that interest in finding the dictator. So it turns out Malcandria is ruled actually more nurtured by a spiritual being, an Oyarsa. It's an angel, basically. And he's aided by lesser angels, Eldilia. And the planet is suffering from climate change, but the people live anxiety free and are happy, and it's a very interesting experience. Um, so a little bit about Divine and Weston. Divine, he's driven by greed, and there's gold all over the place, and he's driven by the belly part of Lewis's model. If you remember from the fake news, I think I presented it in the fake news talk. And Weston, he's driven by kind of intellectual things. He wants to preserve humanity and spread it and conquer. He's like the head part of that, and basically their evilness. They don't have eyes to see the spiritual truths that are all around them. They can't believe what they're seeing. It just bounces off. They're so close-minded about primitive societies and so on that they just cannot see the truth there. It's very interesting about shows the blindness that ideologies and that people can be susceptible to. And so Weston, he wants to extend the human race, and he's actually part of an organization you'll meet in the third book that wants to conquer the human race and then extend it. All right, and he believes might makes right. Because of materialism, everything's an accident, so the only thing that counts is might. He's right from Nietzsche. And humans are technologically superior to the Martians, and therefore they are superior, that kind of thing. And he's definitely an end justifies the means guy. He doesn't care who gets in the way of his plans. They're nothing compared to his aspirations. He's driven by the head part of Lewis's model. And both of them basically are what Lewis describes as men without chests. And it turns out Ransom, who starts out not having much of a chest, ends up growing one while he's there because of the interactions. And here's his model. I think I showed it in the fake news, but maybe I didn't. Three-part model of the person. The right and left brain, rational and imaginative part is the head, and then the heart, the seat of character, the unconscious mind, seat of character, seat of virtue, all that. And then the belly is the appetites. So Divine wants gold and riches, and the other one wants he wants to extend humanity. So one of the questions that comes up is what capabilities make a now? It's basically the image of God idea, but it's kind of elusive, and in this context, there's more to think about it than as we usually do. And what now actually ends up meaning is somebody that deserves human-like respect. That's what it ends up meaning. But the capabilities and how they get it, it's kind of hard to figure out. So everything is explained towards the end of the story, where Ransom gets to finally meet the Oyarsa, and they talk about things. And he finds out that the Oyarsa didn't want a sacrifice. What he wanted was to find out what went on in Earth, because here's the creation story in this book. Every planet has a guiding spirit assigned to it. And the Oyarsa of Earth rebelled against the creator, Mal-el-Dil. And he was not content to oversee one planet. He wanted more planets. So Earth was declared enemy-occupied territory and placed under cosmic quarantine. So they cut off the normal communications with among the angels and in the spiritual realm, and just left them to himself. And the Oyarsa of Mars wanted the person so he could find out what went on Earth. He had no visibility to what went on Earth. And he knows there was that the rebellious Oyarsa of Earth had a battle between him and Mal-el-Dil's representative, basically Jesus. And he couldn't believe anything from Divine and Weston because he could detect that they were bent, that there was something wrong with them, and he couldn't trust with anything they said. And so he wanted somebody that wasn't bent, but it turns out Ransom was somewhat bent. But Ransom at least had some familiarity with the Christian story and told him some things. So there's a lot of speculation and description that some matches the Bible and some a little bit different from the Bible. Very interesting. I don't think there was anything in it, strikingly inconsistent with the Bible, though. At least nothing caught my eye. So Ransom, towards the end, tells him the gospel story, and the Oyarsa is just wondering about it. But the Oyarsa says, Divine and Weston, they are bad news. They have to go back. And he says, Ransom, you can stay if you like, or go home, whatever you want. And Ransom elects to go back. And the trip is very dangerous, but they do make it back. And but the Fiffle-Triggy fixed the ship, so shortly after landing, it self-destructs. And they were hoping that way the contamination from Earth wouldn't re-enter the interplanetary system. But there's numerous hints that there's upcoming interplanetary warfare. The Oyarsa on Earth has designs on the universe, and things are going to happen. So there's various hints that the story's not over. So that's a bit of the storyline and some of the major aspects.